Dr. Staub. He's a rheumatologist in the area at Rheumatology Associates. And that's actually where I have been for a lot of years. And so if you don't know anything about LiveFit with Lupus, we do offer monthly educational meetings. And so usually have a speaker to educate, and then have question and answer support group part of it. And then we also have cooking classes once a month at Hy-Vee, and that is the second Sunday of every month. We do healthy cooking. It's fun. It's upstairs in the club room on Devil's Glen, at Hy-Vee on Devil's Glen and Middle Road. Right? And then we have a fun event coming up, which is Dancing with the QC Stars, and that's going to be 2 nights actually, November 30th and December 1st. So it's just a nice fun fundraiser at the Waterfront Convention Center. And then throughout the year we do we do a big race, which is a half marathon, a 5K, a 10K, 1 mile, a lot of kids activities, live entertainment. And that's in May. That's going to be May 20th, I believe. I need a calendar. I think it's going to be the 3rd Saturday in May. And we also do a golf tournament in August, and I believe that's August 19th of next year. So that's at Palmer Hills in Bettendorf. Those are kind of our 3 main bigger events. And then like just last Saturday, we had this roller derby. They invited us, and they chose our charity to be part of the event. And that was over at Skate Park in Eldridge, which was kind of neat. So yeah, and we have lots of information here. We do have a couple things just because if anybody's Cubs fans. Someone donated some Cubs apparel for us. And so we have different sizes here. These are 25. And then the sweatpants are 20. We have t-shirts, a few, like I think I have 1 or 2 t-shirts left that are $15. They're still in my vehicle. And then we have cookbooks here, just healthy living, kind of healthy foods to help, diminish the inflammation in the body. So these are $10. And these are just save the date cards. I'll pass those around about what's coming up for 2017. So I'll let Dr. Staub introduce himself. How about, and tell us a little bit of your background if you want.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm David Staub, and I've been a rheumatologist in the Quad Cities since 1989, and I did my medical school at the University of Minnesota. I was there for a number of years, did my residency. I was on staff for a year in the general medicine. I ran the ER there at the University of Minnesota. Then I did my rheumatology at the University of Virginia, and then I came here. And that was 1989 when I came here, so I've been in practice for a long time. Lisa and I had talked about this a few years ago, and I actually did a talk on this same topic, and for today, she and I decided we'd do it again, and hopefully it won't be redundant, but it's kind of nice to think about it, even if you hadn't heard it before, because it kind of talks about rheumatology in general. And the thing about our group of diseases that we have in rheumatology is that they there's no one test for them. A patient will come in and say, "Oh, I had the test for lupus and it was positive." Well, yeah, that's one lab test called the ANA, and it might be positive, but there's plenty of people who are otherwise healthy who have that test and they don't have lupus. So it's not the test that defines or excludes lupus. So it's important to understand how rheumatologists think, and that is we think about the whole person and about all potential systems because they can be relevant, and we've come up as a group with these criteria, and I'm going to be talking to you about the criteria, but they define the phenotype. And so the phenotype is just how a person looks. So when we see a person, they have a certain set of symptoms and physical findings and lab test results, and that would be their phenotype. It's determined by the genotype, which is their genes that you get from mom and dad. And those genes, pretty much we now know, drive the whole show. Our genes are what make us, in conjunction with the environment, tweaking the genes a little bit, but the genes are key. So, we've got the genes, we've got the phenotype, and a lot of the genetic studies that are being done now, a lot of the Human Genome Project kind of things that are being done are really in need of definition of the phenotype, because if you just have a bunch of genes and you don't know what the health problem they define is, it really doesn't help you much. So the clinical docs like me, are specialists in defining the phenotype, what the patient looks like, and the bench researchers now are really focusing on the genome. But we're going to talk about the phenotypes here. So hopefully this will. So I talked about this already. The genetic constitution of an individual is the genotype, and the phenotype is the observable set of characteristics that come from the genotype mixed with the environment. And so we define these rheumatic diseases as basically just a group of rheumatologists who get together and come up with our ideas about what is lupus, what is rheumatoid arthritis, how do we define these things? And they're agreed upon. So we have our American College of Rheumatology. I've been a member of that for many years, back when it used to be the American Rheumatism Association, then it changed its name. And then there's the European League Against Rheumatism. That's another example. There's different groups of rheumatologists, in our community that get together. I'll mention some New York Rheumatism Association criteria for one of the diseases. But any group of rheumatologists can get together and make a set of criteria if they want to. And so to understand how we diagnose, it's important to understand what sensitivity and specificity are. If you had a test that was perfect, like if there was a blood test for lupus, then it would be 100% sensitive and 100% specific. So sensitivity is defined as the proportion of people who have the disease who have a positive test result, and specificity is the proportion of people who don't have the disease and have a negative test result. So you can see if it was 100%, that is a perfect test. But there's no such test like that in biology, because biology isn't 100% anything. There's always exceptions, and there's things that are different than the norm. So we never get 100 and 100 on those two. Although it'd be great if we did. My job would be really easy then. So we have, okay. Okay, so just starting with one example, rheumatoid arthritis. We've had several iterations of criteria that have been devised. In fact, when I was in my training back in the mid-1980s, there was one set that got replaced about 15, 20 years later, and then another set came in, and then the latest one is this 2010 set of criteria. And these are much more open for rheumatoid than they used to be. It used to be with the criteria that existed when I was in my early part of my training. They were really tight criteria. So if you met those criteria, if you walked into a rheumatologist's office and you met those old criteria, you had rheumatoid. In fact, we had different gradations. We had classical rheumatoid, then we had definite rheumatoid, and then probable rheumatoid, and then possible rheumatoid. So, the level of confidence got less and less as you went down the scale. And there were criteria, like, for example, one of them was symmetry back in the day, where if it was one wrist, it was the other. If it was one knee, it was the other. Symmetry was a big deal back then. That doesn't show up on these modern criteria. And these modern criteria will collect more people. So the idea is that back in the day when we labeled someone as rheumatoid, they had it, and we could pretty much go ahead with treatments. And some of the treatments are toxic, so we don't want to be giving people toxic treatments if they truly don't have rheumatoid. So back in the day, we were confident they had it, particularly if they had classical rheumatoid. We just went for it. We didn't hesitate. So nowadays, we pick up more people, so there's a bigger pool. And so the rheumatology group, our American College of Rheumatology, decided we would rather capture a larger group of people with that label and thereby get them on treatment sooner than to try and exclude a bunch of people from the diagnosis and then they wouldn't get on treatment. And the reason for that is we now know that in all rheumatic diseases, it's better to get on with treatment early. And particularly in rheumatoid, if you wait, beyond 6 months, symptoms have gone on, and now you're coming in with treatment, particularly if you get into the years after they start, you'll get a worse result than if you got on it right at the front end. If you get going early with treatments and you quiet down the immune system before things really start rolling, you'll have a better outcome. So that's why we decided as a group to collect a larger group of people. So there are people that are labeled with rheumatoid now who would not have met that label back in the 1980s because we use a different set of criteria. Now it's just one joint with definite synovitis. That means that we feel the joint and we feel for bogginess. It's like a spongy feeling. And if you feel that spongy feeling, and there's kind of this boggy feeling, then that would count if a rheumatologist feels that there's at least one joint. Generally, there's way more than one, but at least one. And there also has to be no other disease that might better explain it. So you got to know all of the rest of rheumatology before you can really apply these criteria. So you got to have 6 points. There's got to be, now it turns out that small joints in the hand and feet, so that would be like across the metacarpal phalangeal joints, across the interphalangeal joints, the proximal ones, not these distal ones, but this group or this group count a lot for the criteria. Same thing with the feet across the ball of the foot. Those count a lot. In fact, if you have 10 of those, if you have at least 10 of them, pretty much, and it's going on for more than 6 weeks, the symptom duration is 6 weeks, you've got 6 criteria, and you're off and running with the diagnosis. So hands and feet, really important in rheumatoid. If you have large joints, they don't count for as much. So shoulder, hip, if you got that, it's just essentially a point, even if you've got like even multiple large joints. Antibodies count for a lot. There's the rheumatoid factor. That's a real classical one. It was discovered, many decades ago, long before I was in medical school. But the newer one for rheumatoid is called the CCP antibody. That's the anti-cyclic citrullinate peptide antibody. That one, and if they're in high concentrations, they count for more points than if it's low. Acute phase reactants, these are like sed rate, you may have heard of that, or CRP. These are tests for inflammation, blood tests for inflammation. If they're elevated, either one, you get a point. And then you got to have it at least for 6 weeks. We don't want to label someone with rheumatoid if it hasn't gone on at least 6 weeks, because if you label them prematurely, sometimes these just fizzle out too. So like a person gets a virus, or I've seen a flu vaccine and then they get sick after it or something, and it lasts for a period of time, maybe a month or so, and it goes away. You don't want to call that person rheumatoid. They'd probably never have it again. So that's just one of the criteria. So now I talked about the sensitivity. Oh, here, wait, let's go back. Oops. Getting ahead of myself. Okay. Oh yeah, for rheumatoid. So those criteria, when they're applied to a group of known rheumatoids, these are a bunch of patients that multiple rheumatologists have said, hey, that person has rheumatoid. It's defined by the rheumatologist who has some experience. That is the definition. So with those accepted rheumatoid patients, these criteria collect 82% of the people who have the disease. And but they only the specificity is only 61%. So it's still, it's not as good as you'd like it to be. But these are the kind of numbers we have in biology. So you'd like them to be better, but this is the best. This is the best we've been able to do in rheumatoid. So just a reminder what those two things are. Those are very important terms. So scleroderma, that's a disease in which the skin is thickened, and that is one thing that is a feature of scleroderma. But there are other features. There's internal organ involvement of the lungs and the kidneys, heart, other things. And this group that came up with it was actually a combo group that was both American and European, and they agreed upon that you've got to have at least 9 points. They defined the points, but you have but if you have this finger skin thickening proximal to the MP joint. So in other words, here's the MP joint. Actually that should not be finger. It should just be skin thickening. That's an error. Forget the word finger. It should be skin thickening that's anywhere proximal to these joints. Then you got scleroderma. And but if you don't have that, or like if you have skin thickening distal to the joints, then there's other features that get points. And one of them is sclerodactyly, which is skin thickening distal. Another is Raynaud's. That's where your hands turn colors in the cold. They turn white, then purple, maybe purple, then red. Different sequence. Certain autoantibodies that are well recognized for scleroderma. Scars on the tips of the fingers, and they're caused by ulcers. So they start out as ulcers, and then they move scars. Telangiectasias, they're little red spots like a tangled web of blood vessels. They're little red spots, and if you push your finger on it, it goes away briefly, and then it comes back as it fills back in with blood. That's telangiectasia. And then there's the deal where we can take the eye doctor's instrument called the ophthalmoscope, normally meant to look in the eye, and we instead look at the fingers. So there's two places on the body where you can see capillaries directly. One is in the retina of the eye, and the other is, if you put a little jelly here, we got some we used to use oil for this, but now we just use some water-based KY jelly, basically, and you can see through it. It has a good optical density, and you can actually see these little dilations of the nail folds, and they're characteristic many times of scleroderma. Interstitial lung disease, that's kind of a pulmonary problem. And then pulmonary hypertension, which is actually one of the more feared complications. That's where the artery that feeds the lungs with blood from the right side of the heart, that artery gets under a higher head of pressure. You know, if you have regular blood pressure, so-called systemic blood pressure, then you just take your blood pressure here on your arm or other places, and you know, it's the left side of the heart that provides that pressure, but the right side of the heart feeds the lung, and if that, you can't really put a cuff around that, it's deep inside your chest, so there are other tests for it, but that, when it's defined, is the criteria, and the earlier they are on this list, the more points you get for them, and better at least 9 points, but you know, 2013, and these criteria were pretty good. These are about as good a numbers as you're going to see in medicine. Sensitivity of 91%, specificity of 92. These are that's a really good set of criteria that we have for scleroderma. Sjogren's syndrome is another one. So in 2012, we had our last group of criteria for that. And basically, we apply these to people who come in with dry eyes and dry mouth, essentially. Dry mucous membranes, that's Sjogren's disease. And in fact, the group that does there's a National Sjogren's Syndrome Foundation, and they used to call themselves on their newsletter the moisture seekers. And I'm not sure if that is still the term they use, but I think it is. Anyhow, we now have 3 sets of features, and if a person has only 2 of these, then they can be said to have Sjogren's. And the thing about Sjogren's, or the thing about these criteria, I should have said at the beginning, for all the criteria, they were developed for use in research studies. So the idea is that you have a research study, and you want to know that this group of patients who's being entered into a study in Denver, Colorado, is the same kind of patients that are being entered into a study in, you know, Boston, Massachusetts, or whatever. So you know, that way they can have multiple sites for these different studies and be able to collect more patients to enter and enroll in a therapeutic trial of some kind or another. And so by having defined criteria, we can be sure that we're talking about the same kind of patients, and as long as they all meet the criteria that's agreed on. But these are not meant for clinical studies. So, you know, I mean, I was just talking with my partner earlier today about the idea that sometimes in a clinical practice, these are not perfect. You know, as I showed you, the sensitivity and specificity are not 100%, so it's up to the rheumatologist's judgment a lot of times to really decide if the person has this or that disease. So anyhow, there's one antibody called SSA that originally was called Sjogren's syndrome A, that's what that comes from, or Sjogren's syndrome B. Two antibodies that got those names. These names are somewhat arbitrary. In fact, those very same antibodies, they were developed in 2 different labs. This was a couple decades ago. They were discovered in lab number 1 and lab number 2, and they used different nomenclature. So in the one group of scientists happened to just use the first name of the patient, the first 2 letters of I think the last name, or maybe it was the first name of the patient who had donated the blood, and they called it Rove. I think Roberts was that one for this one, and the other was La Larson, L-A. So anti-Ro and anti-La are the same exact ones as these 2. It's just that they got different names, and these have kind of become more popular names. But some people still use the names Ro and Lon, but, or you could have a positive ANA, anti-nuclear antibody, or positive rheumatoid factor. So that would count as one feature if you had any of those, basically. And then a lip biopsy, that's where the ENT doc goes in to the inside of the mouth and takes a little piece of lip pink tissue and pulls it out, cuts it out, and then you have it sewn up afterwards. And then it's looked at by the pathologist under the microscope, and they can count up the number of foci of inflamed areas, and it gives you this focus score. And if it's positive, there's certain criteria, then it gets labeled as a positive focus score. And then there's a similar ocular staining score where the eye doctor stains puts some kind of a marker, a stain in the eye, just eye drops, and then it kind of shows the cornea in such a way that we can see some dryness and some irritation of the cornea from the dryness, and there's a way that the eye doctor can score it. So if either the pathologist who was working with the ENT doc or the eye doctor come up with a positive, then that would count too. But there's other things that can do it. So someone's had radiation, they've had cancer, let's say, and they got the neck radiated. That can zap the salivary glands, which in turn make it so that the person has dry mouth. So you don't want to be calling someone who's had radiation therapy a Sjogren's patient, because in fact it has nothing to do with Sjogren's, everything to do with radiation. And some other diseases can also mimic Sjogren's, like hepatitis C, HIV, sarcoidosis. That's kind of an unusual inflammatory disease. It can affect a lot of different body parts, and then even other ones. So you have to be sure, you really know the patients before you actually apply the label of Sjogren's. And the sensitivity and specificity are quite good. 96 and 83, that's pretty good. Fibromyalgia, 2012. We used to call this fibrositis. That used to be the name when I was in my training. But then there were several criteria groups over the course of time. The most recent one, 2012, is I'm sorry, not fibromyalgia, polymyalgia. Yeah, I was thinking over 50, it's not fibromyalgia. Fibromyalgia is under 50 for onset. Let's see. Polymyalgia, that is older people, over 50, shoulder aching, and a high SED rate or CRP. And you have to start with that. I have seen an occasion, a rare patient who didn't have shoulder involvement with PMR, may have had hips only, but that isn't really, doesn't make you feel that confident if you label a bilateral hip patient with morning stiffness. You still don't feel too good about labeling that one polymyalgia, but shoulders are important. And then they have points, once again, because we love points in rheumatology. Morning stiffness, preferably for even an hour, but at least 45 minutes. And here you've got criteria that talk about not having something. So usually we talk about you got to have this, you got to have that, you got to have this. Well, here you got to not have a rheumatoid factor, and you ought to not have an anti-CCP antibody. And if I see a person that I'm thinking is PMR, polymyalgia rheumatica, who has a rheumatoid factor or has a CCP, I'm thinking that person is going to have rheumatoid ultimately, most likely, because it's quite common for someone, particularly an older person, to come in and look like rheumatoid, but actually, or to look like polymyalgia rheumatica, but actually what they have is rheumatoid. That's pretty common. So if you don't want to see it, you want to check it and make sure it's negative. And then, you get a little bit of points for hip pain, because it is part of it. Classically, it was hips and shoulders, but the shoulders are more important. And so 68% sensitive and 78% specific. So they're just provisional criteria. They haven't been totally fully accepted. So lupus. So in 1997, this was after I was in practice for a number of years. The first ones came out. There were ones before that we had even before that. I've kind of long forgotten now, because we had these changeover, and there's some new ones that have come out, and I'll talk about those. But these are the ones that we've used for the bulk of my career. Malar rash, that's redness on the cheeks. Discoid rash, that's a certain kind of a rash that can leave scars. It's often on the scalp, on the shoulders where the sun is hit. Photosensitivity, meaning sun-caused problems. So in other words, it could be the problems from the sun causing rashes, but it also could be the sun causes persons to not feel well and have joint pains even after prolonged sun exposure. Even a minor sun exposure. I've had some patients who can't even walk from the building to the car in the middle of the summer, and then just a little bit of sunlight while they go there can trigger problems. Oral ulcers, classically they were said to be painless, just ulcers in the mouth, but they can actually hurt. There's plenty of exceptions to that. In contrast to rheumatoid, where you see erosions on x-ray, you see big bites taken out of bone. In rheumatoid, in lupus you don't, so-called non-erosive. Pleuritis or pericarditis. So pleuritis is where a person takes a deep breath and it hurts and it lingers for a period of time. Many people have experienced that. Pericarditis is where you lean forward, particularly like you're laying down, you lean forward, and when the heart kind of touches up against the chest wall, it kind of irritates the lining around the heart, and you get this pericarditis. So inflammation of the membrane around the heart, and inflammation of the membrane around the lung, so-called pleuritis and pericarditis.
Hit continue on there and that'll go away.
Oh, just join. I don't want to join it. Just exit out, you mean?
Just hit the continue button, it should go away for you.
I don't have a continue button.
Left side.
Left side. You mean up here?
It's on the screen here. Do you have a touch screen?
No. Oh, yeah. Okay. The last time I just knocked this out with that guy.
Night. Yeah, just.
Oh, there it is.
There you go. You're back.
So we're back to where we started. Yeah, renal disorder, that was excess protein in the urine, or poor excretion of creatinine, which is the measurement of how well the kidney is functioning. Neurologic disorder, that traditionally was two things. It was either psychosis or seizures, one of those two. Hematologic, that was low white count, low hemoglobin, low platelet count. And immunologic disorder, that was classically the positive ANA. That was also certain other antibodies called anti-Smith and anti-DNA antibodies. And, well, actually, I'm sorry, positive ANA was a separate one. This is anti-Smith, anti-DNA. And then years ago, it was recognized that the test for syphilis sometimes cross-reacted with certain antibodies that were common in lupus patients. And this was recognized back in the day. And I have had patients years ago who had told me when they got married and they got checked for syphilis, which is what used to happen, they got labeled as having had syphilis. Well, in fact, they didn't have syphilis. What they had was this lupus-induced antiphospholipid antibody that cross-reacted with the syphilis test, so it led to a lot of distress, a newly marrying person.
My mom had that.
Did she?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's terrible for people. I mean, I've had a number of patients over the years where that had happened. They told me that it happened, but in our, I mean, that was long ago when they used to require a blood test before you got married. Now they don't require that, of course, anymore. But it was miserable for some people. It led to all kinds of problems before marriage. So, got this. Traditionally we said if there were four, oh no, this is the newest ones here. Okay, so if you have four of these, you are given a label of lupus. And now the Systemic Lupus International Collaborative Clinics criteria were developed because some people in the lupus community felt that these were skewed a little bit too much toward skin problems. And that was one problem with it. They also felt like there was a lot more neurologic things that could happen in lupus that were relevant that were not accounted by the two that were in here, which is seizures and psychosis. There's all kinds of things. There's transverse myelitis, there's peripheral neuropathy, there's mononeuritis multiplex. There's a bunch of stuff that was not included here, and they thought, we could include those and make for better criteria, improve the sensitivity and specificity. Also, under this one, it didn't include what we call complement levels. These are blood proteins that drop in lupus. and many people thought it should include that. So there were some issues with the other ones that were thought, hey, we can make it better. So they thought, let's come up with some similar stuff. Oh, and the other thing was, it was thought that if someone came in with say they went to their kidney doctor, and the kidney doctor did a biopsy, and lo and behold, it was lupus, and they never knew that they had lupus, and you got lupus. Well, those criteria wouldn't pick up that case. So the person wouldn't, say, have been able to enter in a study, even though nobody would doubt that they had lupus. They had a biopsy, it showed lupus, they have a positive ANA. That person could not get in the study protocol because they didn't meet the criteria. So they thought, we got to change this a little bit. So these new criteria were made, and so there were these 9 clinical criteria, and there's 4 criteria that are more lab-based, and you got to have at least 1 from this category, at least 1 from this category, and then you got to have 4 in total. So, and they're kind of similar. The one thing they included was alopecia, which is thinning of the hair, and that's new. They also they kind of tweaked the definitions here a little bit. They changed the renal. It used to be that you had to have a 24-hour urine to check for protein. That was old-fashioned. Now we just get a spot urine specimen, and it's just single urination into a cup, and then you can test for the protein. It's a lot better. But so they changed. They kind of updated it. They included all those neurologic things that I mentioned, and then they kind of defined these a little better. They added the complement levels, and they added this thing called the direct Coombs test. That's just basically an antibody that causes hemolytic anemia. So they thought, we're going to do these new ones here, and then we'll make things better. But look at what happened. This is what the 1997 criteria were. Sensitivity jumped up on the new ones. 97, that's pretty good. So that means you're correctly labeling people as lupus. That's good. But look at this. You're missing more people here. You go from 96 down to here. That's bad. So while it got better here, it got worse here. So a lot of people said, hey, this didn't really help. Maybe we've got as far as we can get with these criteria, because there was a lot of effort that went into coming up with these new criteria. And so many rheumatologists kind of just use both of them. So if I have a patient who meets either this set of criteria or this set, I'm going to most likely use the label of lupus, unless I think it's some other disease, which there are other things that can kind of look like it. And I'll talk about some of those. Now, fibromyalgia, 1990 we had criteria. We had these preliminary criteria in 2010, then we had the 2011 modification of the 2010 criteria. And so they thought, the thing is, when they went to this one, it increased the prevalence of fibromyalgia 4-fold. So just how you define patients, you can get a bigger group or a smaller group. So this last set gives a much larger group of people the label of fibromyalgia. But with this last set, the sensitivity is 90%, specificity 89%, so it's not too bad. There's lots of diseases that have criteria. Gout, the first ones were published in 1977. And these are not all ACE, American College of Rheumatology approved, but it might just be one guy who published it. Like these New York criteria was just a few people published it from New York, and for ankylosing spondylitis. But these different ones, gout, osteoarthritis, there's ones for the knee, ones for the hands, one for the hip, different years. Giant cell arteritis, that's inflammation of a blood vessel, kind of either a temporal artery, or even some of the bigger arteries like the aorta can get inflamed with that. Wegener's, that's another kind of artery inflammation. And there's other forms of vasculitis, and they were all kind of characterized back in those days. They haven't really been changed a whole lot since then. Childhood arthritis, 2005. There's one, as I was driving here, I realized I forgot psoriatic arthritis. I didn't even put that on there, but that has criteria. And psoriatic arthritis is where the person has psoriasis, and some of the criteria include dactylitis. That'd be like an entire finger. Like you might have just this finger, and it's inflamed, and it's not just inflamed at the joint, it's the whole thing. It might be the tissue here, it might be here, it's the whole thing. And if you were to do a biopsy, which we don't do, but if you were, you'd find inflammation all the way from the outer lining of the bone all the way up to the skin, and it's called dactylitis. And it's just one digit, or it might be two. It might be this one, it might be that one, or it might be a middle toe on the left foot, and just nothing else. It's asymmetric, and so that'd be one. There's also, you got to have psoriasis to be labeled psoriatic. There's a criterion that involves the fingernails getting thickened and they look kind of like they got fungus on them. In fact, I've had a lot of patients who got treated for fungus of their fingernails or toenails, but what they actually have is psoriasis. And particularly if there's pitting of the fingernails, that's very much a sign. If a person with, many people with psoriasis never get arthritis, but if a person with psoriasis has pitting, little divots in their fingernails, then you got to worry that they might be a psoriatic patient eventually. But I forgot to even put that up here. And then there's certain X-ray features that are part of the psoriatic arthritis criteria set. So this is how we think. We just think about psoriasis, think about different criteria. So now, just to make, if it isn't hard enough with these sensitivities and specificities that are not 100% and 100%, well, it's even more tricky because occasionally you come across a person who actually meets criteria for 2, sometimes even more illnesses. So here's a single person, and that single person has met criteria for rheumatoid, but they also meet criteria for lupus. And that's one person who meets criteria for 2 diseases, and that's called an overlap syndrome. And in fact, that particular one we call lupus. There are I've got a number of people who've had lupus. And sometimes it can be over time. Like, I'm thinking of one gal in particular who I followed for many years, and she's had rheumatoid and then lupus and then rheumatoid and all the correct antibodies and everything. And over time it's changed. I've seen that happen in other people. Start out Sjogren's and move toward lupus over 10 years, or start out lupus and move toward Sjogren's. So these are, you can see that these are not just handed down from on high and this is the disease. It's like, it can change, and it's the immune system. And the immune system, why do we have a dynamic immune system? Well, it's because today there's some bug that's going to get us, and tomorrow it's a different bug. So the immune system has to really gear up. And so when the immune system is very changeable and able to be dynamic like that, it can, when it's doing bad things, which is attacking the body and causing rheumatic diseases, it can also do different bad things. So it can do good things and change it up day by day or week by week or month by month, and it can do bad things in the same way. So overlap syndromes, we do see them. Now, just to, if it's not enough confusion here, I'm going to throw one more thing at you. Mixed connective tissue disease. So, you know, we think, well, that's an overlap syndrome. Well, no, this is actually a defined thing. There's a guy in Missouri, Columbia, Missouri, named Gordon Sharp, and he has built his career on this thing. And many people, when he said it existed, said, forget it, that's just lupus. You know, don't call it that. Or that's just, it's basically got features of lupus, it's got features of scleroderma, it's got features of polymyositis, which I didn't mention yet, but that, we have criteria for that too, and I also neglected to mention, but polymyositis is a muscle disease, basically, but it has other things. But anyhow, these 3 things together in one person with this particular antibody, called an RNP antibody, and then sometimes they have erosions, sometimes they have Raynaud's, often early in the disease, and then this pulmonary hypertension shows up late. There's other diseases, other things too, but mixed connective tissue disease, people said, oh, forget it, that's nothing, it's lupus. Others said, hey, it's something, but over time, there's been, 1,200 different publications on this topic, not just by Gordon Sharp, but others, and so it's kind of become accepted. I think most rheumatologists believe in mixed connective tissue disease. I certainly have labeled people that, and over time have treated people for that. One problem that happens is, if you say, not so much in this, but sometimes if you don't pick the right disease, sometimes the insurance companies don't cover it well. But I think just from a biologic point of view, this is legit. It's a good way to label a person if they meet the criteria for it. So now, as if it's not enough confusion, one last thing to throw at you. What about a person who isn't overlapped? They don't meet separate criteria, and they're not this kind of unique mixed connective tissue disease, but now this person comes in, and they got a little bit of this and a little bit of that, not enough for full criteria for rheumatoid or for polymyositis, for psoriatic, but you got a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Well, then we can use this term Undifferentiated systemic rheumatic disease, I usually use UCTD, undifferentiated connective tissue disease, but it's the same thing. And it's been estimated that up to 25% of people who just show up in rheumatology clinics, or at least the ones with inflammatory disease, not bursitis or something, but inflammatory illness, might have this, and it might be the best label to use. People don't like it. You know, people walk into the rheumatologist's office and they say, what's my diagnosis? What do I have? And so, you know, they don't like leaving with this thing because it's like, what the heck? I don't even know what that is. It's like, what's he talking about? But this is a defined disease, and there have been studies of people in America who've gone along over time with this label at the front end, and some of them do, and 13% in this one study developed rheumatoid lupus after 10 years. 15% of them developed scleroderma after 10 years. 3% rheumatoid, 3% MCTD, complete remission, and 6%. And that kind of just underscores what happens in these diseases. They can go big, they can change, they can drop off and do nothing. So, but this term is a good term, and pretty much we all use it. It's just that when we use it, we got to have a long explanation to the patient because they don't like this kind of grab bag term. So, and that might be it. That's I think that's it for my lecture. And thank you very much. But if you have some questions, I'm willing to take questions.
Yeah, can you say a little more about myositis, the thing with the muscles?
Yeah. Did you have a specific question about it?
Like tests, like what does a low CK test?
Yeah, so the CPK is one of two tests, two muscle enzymes. The other one's the aldolase that we commonly get, but those two are blood tests. They're called chemistries, and basically they're common. They can be drawn, pretty much run in most labs, and they're not antibody tests. They're just looking at there's enzymes. Every cell in our body has enzymes in it. Enzymes are used to make reactions happen and build or break down tissue, whatever it might be. Enzymes are the workhorse molecules of the cells. And so these enzymes, creatine phosphokinase, known as CPK, or aldolase, are enzymes within the cell. So when the muscle cell is having troubles, its membrane that bounds it, that kind of holds it all together, starts to get weakened, and some of those enzymes leak out. They leak out of the muscle cell and they get into the bloodstream. Now they will do that pretty much always to some extent. That's why when you look at a lab report, it'll say the CPK normal range is from 35 to 190 or something like that. And so everybody's CPK will, or most everybody will be in that range. But when the cell gets kind of leaky membrane, it leaks out too much, so your number might be 400 or 1500. And the thing is, there's a lot of gradation in it. It turns out the curves are different for different genders. So males, there's a bell-shaped curve that defines most Caucasian males, and that they run higher numbers than the bell-shaped curve that defines Caucasian females. And then there's yet another set for African American males and females. The African American male has the highest CPK of any group. The African female has second highest, and then the Caucasian male, and then the Caucasian female. It kind of goes down like that. And so you got to know the ranges. But anyhow, as far as your question goes, the CPK is a muscle enzyme, and that's a marker. So the more damage ongoing to the muscle, the higher the number. And you can see really high numbers sometimes. Well, into the 20,000 range or something. That's a bad deal. But part of the criteria for diagnosing it is to get a biopsy of muscle, and it should be a biopsy done by a surgeon who takes either from the quadriceps or the deltoid muscle a stretch of muscle fiber, like a bundle, and takes the whole thing from one end to the other. And because if you just go in with a needle and try to take out a chunk of muscle, you'll damage it all, and you get little fragments of muscle, and it's far better to have it done by a surgeon who really knows the proper technique to get a good biopsy. And then we don't typically, if I'm serious about working that up. What we do is we have an arrangement with Genesis where the person goes in and gets the muscle biopsy, and then they have it put in a cooler with some special preservative, and it goes straight to the University of Iowa, where there's a guy there. They have done a real good job with muscle biopsies there because this guy Stephen Moore has really made it a big priority to do it right, and you have to not just use regular stains to prep the muscle. You got to use special, what are called histochemical stains and electron microscopy, and to really do it right, you got to have somebody who just does that all the time. If around in a town, where there's not enough muscle biopsies being done, there won't be in any kind of smaller town. Even our town, we don't have a pathologist who's really dedicated to that. So I send them all. They can have the procedure done at Genesis or Unity, but they've got to have it sent to the University of Iowa and collected in the proper way in the OR here. Otherwise, it's kind of not so useful. But yeah, so we do the biopsy. We have the correct clinical presentation, and then you got to then ultimately get the label of either polymyositis or dermatomyositis. They're basically very similar, but dermatomyositis has a skin rash, and the skin rash is actually opposite lupus. Lupus typically on the rash affects this area of the fingers, whereas dermatomyositis affects the knuckles here and knuckles here. We call that, in dermatomyositis, called Gottron's papules. They come across here and across here, and so they look kind of opposite lupus. Yet, when we do a biopsy, like sometimes we do a skin biopsy to see if it's lupus or dermatomyositis, because sometimes those can maybe still be a little confusing to separate because they both can be worse in the sun. And the skin biopsy looks exactly the same. So the pathologist will say, well, it's either dermatomyositis or lupus. Can't tell which from the biopsy, but it's one of the two. That's a common thing. It's got certain features that are common. So, any other questions about that?
I don't think so. I didn't ever hear about the rash on the knuckles. So are you saying that if you had that, you would also have a rash on your knuckles?
If you have dermatomyositis, you often would have this Gottron's rash, often. Now, sometimes the dermatomyositis rash doesn't show up there, but it often does.
Okay.
For dermatomyositis. Polymyositis has no rash. So, any other questions?
So, like in your specialty, would you say that you deal with more, just like a variety of different patients like that, or do you deal with more rheumatoid patients, or?
Well, we just take all comers. A lot of times the family doc, we have a requirement that the family doc has to make the referral. So if the family doc thinks it's in our category, then we say yes and we see the person. Someone in our group.
Now you have the 3 of you now there. Are you getting another one?
Yeah, we have another fellow coming, Dr. Kalaya is coming in November, it looks like. We have to get all of his insurance, all the different insurance payers to line up with him. You got to submit all your applications to United and to Medicare and this, that, and the other thing. So we're going through all that, but it looks like it will be sometime in November.
Is he from Iowa City, or?
He trained. So I have Dr. Sunita Penmacha. She's been with me the longest, and then Dr. Lindsay Orris. She came about 2 years ago, and then Dr. Orris and Dr. Kalaya both were fellows together. They were both at the University of Iowa together. They started together. They know each other very well. And they're very, very good. We're happy to have them.
We always have need referrals.
Yeah, definitely. He'll be a good one for people to see. Yeah.
I know.
I was asking her about that because at the University of Iowa, I've been there in rheumatology so far, and I was asking if anybody kind of specialized in lupus within rheumatology.
Yeah, I will tell you that I think most rheumatologists like lupus just because, when you ask a person why do they go into rheumatology, often, well, because of lupus. That is, it's interesting. It's multi-system. It's not just the joints, like say, but rheumatoid isn't just the joints either. Rheumatoid can affect the heart and affect the lungs. So it's not, but there's something about lupus. It's skin. Well, the rheumatoid can affect the skin too. But a lot of times lupus is would make people go into rheumatology. Many of us did because of lupus. And so we like treating lupus, we feel good about it. But, you know, I can't say that there's a doctor's, I'm not aware of a doctor in private practice. You know, I'm thinking of people I know in Minnesota and other places who just focus on lupus alone. Except for maybe at the Mayo Clinic, there's a guy who came down and talked to us at our annual meeting in Iowa City, and I forget his name now, but he was kind of their go-to lupus guy. One of the things they do at Mayo is they'll tell a person who's new in I know this because I have a friend in one of the departments up there, and he said, look, they tell you you're going to become an expert in X, Y, or Z. And so you're in our department, but this is your disease, and it may be when you want it, maybe when you don't want it, but you're going to be the go-to guy or gal on that disease. But if you talk about private practice like in Des Moines and other places, you're not going to find people who just focus on one thing only, typically. But you will, like, for example, in Chicago, there's a gal, Daphne Gladman, who is focused on lupus. But you think for all of Chicago, there ought to be more than one person. And that's the only one that I know who has done that, just made it, that's her only thing, it's going to be lupus. But typically then it will be a person doing research, so she's done research on it. And I think that's what this fellow at Mayo is going to do. I wish I could remember his name. He's a younger guy, but he's their go-to lupus guy. And certainly any kind of you know, studies that come up, he'll be the point guy for those.
I would, you know, as far as what she was talking about, I mean, there's now going to be almost 4 of you, you know, kind of convenient in town that, you know,
Yeah,
still
I mean,
work on lupus patients.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, it's like a cardiology group, you know, what you have, well, you do have one guy, John Robkin, he focuses a lot on doing catheterizations and putting stents in, so, but, you know, he's getting a little older, so they've got to get other guys in there who all do it, you know, so there are guys or gals who just focus on one little thing in a bigger group. That's a big group, cardiology, that's a bigger group. So yeah, when you get to a certain point, you might do that, I suppose. I mean, we've never even talked about that issue. Never came up. I mean, we just barely have 4 of us.
Yeah.
For a long time it was 2 of us. For a long time it was 1. But
yeah.
so now it's going to be 4. So that's the new thing for us. So we have,
Yeah.
yeah, we, you
But
know,
I
we
mean,
got
there's still, like we said, there's still this, you know, available in the area.
Yeah, in terms of, I don't know that, is there someone at the University of Iowa who is declared as the lupus person?
No, that's, when I was asking
yeah,
them, and they said, no, not really.
No, I don't
Like,
think so.
I said, like, you know, just like lupus is really interesting to them, or they have
Yeah.
a lot of patients who have lupus.
Yeah, I think
No,
any
not
given,
really,
any
you know?
given rheumatologist is happy to see a lupus patient.
Yeah, just-
Okay, you know, rheumatoid is far more common than lupus, for one thing. So you're going to see more rheumatoid just because you see there's more people with it.
I can always remember him telling me that he got into, you know, rheumatology because of lupus, because
Yeah.
he was enamored by it.
Yeah,
You
that's
know,
true.
it's the dynamics of it, how your body works. And so when someone's intrigued by it, they're going to, you know, they're going to study
Learn more
about
about it.
So any other questions?
Does it always also work the other way around? Like, say you're really intrigued by lupus. Are there other doctors out there that, you know,
That wouldn't want to do
lupus,
it?
they don't want to get into that because
I
there's so
can't-
much.
I can't think of another doctor who said that to me. I mean, there may well be one, but if I haven't heard a doctor say that to me. With that, they felt that way about lupus. You know, if they're a rheumatologist. Now, if it's a family doc or something, yeah, I mean, they would say that.
You want to challenge.
But yeah, but not a rheumatologist. I don't think I've ever heard a rheumatologist tell me that. I don't remember it. If I have heard it, I've forgotten it. So,
Just one. There's
Yeah.
so much that goes on with lupus.
yeah, I haven't heard a rheumatologist say that. Never.
That's good.
Do you deal with a lot of the mixed connective tissue disease then?
Yeah, I would say that's even less common than lupus, MCTD. But we do see it. You know, and a number of patients over the years have had it.
Isn't that a tough call between, you know, deciding
Yeah.
between the lupus and?
Yeah, there have been times when I've labeled a person MCTD and then I'd see them at a later time and think, maybe it actually is lupus. I've had that occasion.
It's
And
interesting.
things do change over time.
That's what I was thinking, like,
Yeah.
I've had a lot of patients just seeing, you know, even in the last 4 years, being part of this, where, you know, you see some things change, and then they develop another symptom, and then another symptom, and then they maybe had this diagnosis first, and now they got this diagnosis.
Absolutely, that happens, and that's legit. It definitely happens.
Your immune system is-
And I've changed my label on people over time in my practice, where I gave the first label and now I'm giving a new label. It's not like I've changed my mind. It's just now their disease has changed enough where it's different.
Yeah, I was looking at my label, and it's pretty concrete. Just going over that again, you know. So,
So,
thank you so
yeah,
much.
you bet. Well, thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.